Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending Public Land Grazing 101, a multi-state discussion on how to start and build a public land grazing program. I'm Kelsey Virgin. I'm a project manager with the Pasture Project at the Wallace Center, who is hosting the series along with Mary C. Anderson from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So as I mentioned, we are hosting the series with Wisconsin DNR. We're also hosting it on the online community practice platform Regenerative Ag Idea Network, or REGAIN. REGAIN is an online community practice designed for all regenerative agriculture educators, advocates, and practitioners. If you haven't already, we encourage you to become a member. It's free and it's easy to do. And as part of this series, we've created a discussion group, which you can see here on my screen. To continue the conversation we start here. So if you have questions that you didn't get to ask, or if you think of something else, you can join this discussion group and ask your questions. It's also a great way to connect with peers. You can also share photos and files, and it's a great way to connect with people across the country on a specific topic. Okay. So let's get into some introduction. So the Pasture Project is part of the Resilient Agriculture and Ecosystems Initiative of the Wallace Center at Winrock International. Pasture Project works to advance regenerative grazing and grass-fed value chains in the upper Midwest as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities. As we mentioned, Pasture Project is co-hosting this series with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. The DNR is dedicated to working with Wisconsinites while preserving and enhancing natural resources of Wisconsin. In partnership with individuals and organizations, DNR staff manage fish, wildlife, forests, parks, air, and water resources while promoting a healthy, sustainable environment and a full range of outdoor opportunities. So a little bit of how we got here today to this series. In 2014, Pasture Project began working with collaboration with Wisconsin DNR and the University of Wisconsin to develop a more formalized and sustainable grazing program. And then in 2018, the DNR hired a dedicated conservation, agriculture, and grazing specialist, Mary C. Anderson, who has successfully created a well-structured and supported conservation grazing program within the agency, which she's going to talk a little bit about today. Pasture Project wanted to understand the broader landscape of grazing on public land throughout the Midwest, and so we did lots of interviews. And through those interviews, we found that there was a critical need for technical assistance and support on the nuts and bolts of grazing on public land. And while we hope to have an in-person convening on an active grazing site, the pandemic had other plans, and so we've pivoted to host these conversations virtually through REGAIN. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first two presenters today. We have Erin Grossman. She's a graduate of UW River Falls with a BA in biology. She began her career with Wisconsin DNR after graduation as a limited term employee. For the next 6 years, Erin worked at various field stations around Wisconsin conducting habitat work, CWD surveillance, and assisting where needed within the wildlife management program. Erin was briefly employed by Pheasants Forever as a farm bill biologist before attaining her first permanent position at Wisconsin DNR in 2008 as a wildlife technician at Buena Vista Wildlife Area, where she was first introduced to grazing as a habitat management tool. Erin has been in her current position as wildlife biologist for 3 years. Also presenting today, Mary C. Anderson has been working in the conservation and management grazing for over 28 years and is an experienced grazer of 100% organic grass-finished beef. Mary C. is working with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, developing the strategic plan and other supporting documents to expand grazing on DNR-owned and managed properties for the benefit of habitat restoration, assisting habitat managers with grazing implementation, and building partnerships with livestock owners that have the capacity to graze these properties. Okay, so along with presenting, Mary C is also co-hosting the series with me, so thank you both. Thank you, Erin and Mary C, for being willing to share your expertise, and so I'm going to hand it off to you, Erin.
All right, well, thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for joining today. I just want to share a little bit about my journey in connecting and finding grazers to graze on public lands, and this is just a little bit of my story and how I came to where I am today. So the backstory: when I got to Buena Vista, which is in central Wisconsin, it's about an hour and a half north of Madison. This landscape and the properties are 3 large landscape surrogate grasslands The largest Buena Vista is about 14,000 acres, fairly contiguous, pretty fortunate in that regard. And we're home to the Wisconsin population of greater prairie chickens. This was, like I said, my first permanent position with DNR, and they'd been grazing here for many years prior. They'd have paddocks for 1 or 2 years, average size was 100 acres. So for this part of central Wisconsin, and for the other staff that worked in this area, grazing was not a new and novel concept. Just, as you go along in your career, time passes, you get familiar with what you're working on, staff changes, we have staff reductions. I really started to sink my teeth into the management. Things change. So somewhere intermittently throughout my career in central Wisconsin, and more heavily in 2013 and 14, we had sort of a little bit of outside pressure to do something more, something different. In the eyes of some, what we were doing wasn't working. It wasn't working for the prairie chickens. So, you start to think outside the box, and grazing, I felt, was a good tool, but is there another way to essentially prescribe it on the landscape? Around the same time, there were additional field staff that were interested in grazing as a habitat management technique. And oops, sorry about that. So we formed, it started at the field. So we formed this ad hoc grazing group of sorts. And I have a hard time remembering how it all happened, but it was just a vehicle for habitat managers, biologists, and technicians to get together, share their information, experiences, and what we were doing. And then, so amongst this and attending events and pasture walks, we at Buena Vista, as I said, didn't want to do more of the same or similar. I was working with a really engaged, really eager LTE that wanted to dig into the rotational grazing concept that we had heard of, but we were not utilizing at that time. So in the summer of 2014, basically had the conversation and allowed him to go forth, find a grazer that you think we can work on, keep me in the loop, so we can figure out budget and workload together, the necessary info. And he used the contacts we had gotten from pasture walks and other trainings and found an interested rancher who also happened to be a county grazing specialist, who was also up for a challenge. So, sometimes things just line up. And in this case, I would say they definitely did for us. And that's really helped, I think, help us get to where we are today. So kind of the next steps in there, part of this was we didn't want to just utilize this new technique. We wanted to really understand it, understand the different benefits of rotational grazing, specifically how to utilize it, and to be savvy and informed habitat managers that utilizing this tool. A lot of what we had heard and saw was grazing to maximize production, which is good stuff, important for those whose career is raising beef animals and making a living off of that. But that wasn't necessarily what we were into. We knew that was important, but in terms of habitat management, that's what we wanted to learn the grazing stuff so we could learn how best to apply it to the landscape to reach our objectives. Just a good comparison for that might be, in the upper Midwest, we conduct a lot of prescribed fire on our grasslands. And we don't just want to put fire on the ground to make things black. We are constantly learning and engaging to figure out how we can apply fire in a way that better allows us to reach our objectives. And we locally, for grazing, wanted to be similar students and practitioners of grazing on our habitat management areas. So a few of the things that we did, and I've done these with this first project I was a part of, and a few subsequent projects. we went to this rancher's home farm, see what they're doing, how their pasture looks, what residual means to them. So we could kind of have a calibrated comparison to what we thought we wanted with what, the same language looked like to them, just to make sure we're kind of on the same page, or at least we're calibrated to what the rancher meant versus what we meant. And we also use this time in the field to talk about DNR habitat goals, to listen to what the rancher goals were, what the needs were, as we're entering into this team, essentially, just to have a really good understanding. So, you see communication there at the bottom, and, this is really critical in any new endeavor, any team that you're developing, to gain, especially when there's something new, to gain an understanding of both sides. These initial conversations we had set the foundation that we were a team, we succeed together or we fail together, and set some expectations. Kind of as an aside, once cows were on this pasture, we talked almost daily at the start. It wasn't, a long conversation, could be quick check-ins, quick texts, but communication was frequent. And this is different for everybody. When I switched positions and started this new grazing project where I am right now, the rancher I work with now does not need as frequent communication. This could be because of the type of grazing we're doing is not rotational, it's just a different type, or it could just be the rancher's communication style. So for whatever reason, those differences are out there, but I do believe that communication is key, and at a minimum with the rancher I'm working with now, I try to check in every other week and as needed. And you can imagine there are certain times when stress levels go up that communication is higher, and that's frankly to be expected. Some logistics and infrastructure. So fencing, I knew how to do that. I built a lot of fence. Rancher helped us build it. On this project, water was a bigger challenge. He wanted well water. No, didn't want to water out of ponds. We installed a point well, and with gravity flow out of that big tank you saw there, which just so everybody notes, water does not always flow downhill. And then, of course, a critical component is the cows. And these are a piece of cake, well-behaved, no fence breakers. And I always joke with folks, I'd rather hang out with the four-legged beasts on the property than the two. So, but they're a pretty important component of all this. So, and then just real briefly, some challenges. So, every new project is going to have some challenges. As I mentioned real briefly, water was my biggest challenge the first year. The point well worked great, but when temperatures heat up, you get oxygen in the water and it actually flows back uphill. So when you're working with living creatures, it just adds a little bit more stress that I hadn't anticipated. So there's a few other things. So logistics and infrastructure, these are some common ones that myself and some of my colleagues have identified throughout their experiences, that are some challenges that they have worked through, are working through, and probably are fairly common with some of you folks that are out there doing similar projects. One other note that I will make, and I've learned this, is the challenge, to grow with the project. We had invested infrastructure and time and money in setting this up. And sometimes it's not quite right. You need to invest more to get it up to where it needs to be. And that was a little bit of a hard step for me, but totally worth it. And just understand that it's a step, it's a process, and you might have to invest more to get it where you want to be. And hopefully you can use that other equipment and investment elsewhere. I will also say there seems like there's always something new, something unexpected that's going to happen, regardless of how long you've been doing this. And it just, one gets better at mitigating and understanding and dealing with the bumps as they happen, the longer they've been doing this. But to know ahead of time what those challenges may be can help staff knowing the contacts within your department, within your program, and outside of it that can assist when it comes to permitting, especially, that can assist and ease that process, I think is an important component of getting through some of these challenges. And of course, the opportunities and successes. This is all the stuff that we all want to talk about, the good things, not the mud pits that we find ourselves with sometimes or feel like we're in. And on this project at Buena Vista, one of the really cool things for me a couple years in was we found a prairie chicken nest in an actively grazed pasture, rotationally grazed pasture. We went back later and observed the nest had successfully hatched. We don't know what happened to the chicks, but we know that they hatched. And frankly, that was really cool for me to know that while management is being done on the landscape, we are providing habitat and good habitat for the wildlife that's using the property. Also, you can see a picture, we found some cool dung rolling beetles, which not really an insect person, but that was pretty awesome, frankly. And then one of the other benefits there, you can read the list, but we had annual pasture walks open to the public. We did a few media articles and outreach and such. And I felt that with those, we got exposure to groups. As a department, we got exposure to groups that maybe didn't give a lot of thought or appreciation or understanding of our public lands. So we were able to reach out to those different people and share what we have here in Central Wisconsin, share why it's unique and pretty awesome, and just to get that exposure to different groups I think is valuable, especially as an agency. Department reaction. So something new, you never know how folks are going to react inside or outside your department. A lot of colleagues were interested, lots of conversations I had before and during the project. The grazer that I was working with, we took our show on the road, as I say, the first couple of years, speaking at Grossberg conferences, Wisconsin Chapter of Wildlife Society, wildlife management statewide meetings, roundtables and presentations, good attendance. The interest varied. Some were a bit overwhelmed, as I can truly appreciate. Some were not so optimistic. So it ran the gamut. I can remember a friend and colleague of mine said something to the effect of, we all can't have a grazing specialist be the grazer on our properties. Right? Well, no, you can't. But my hope with this project when I started it was to be able to share the knowledge I had gained from this project, to be able to be a resource and to help other managers, be there for questions and to be an advocate for this, because I do feel like grazing had some unique abilities to be able to do habitat management for us on the landscape. And then within our DNR leadership in the wildlife management program, my direct supervisor was very supportive and interested. He was a pretty big advocate. So that was great. Our wildlife leadership team came out for a pasture walk, interested and supportive, lots of good questions. And this was around the 2016 time period. And for us in Wisconsin, our journey through grazing has been a pretty field-driven endeavor at the very beginning. And I think what occurred during this time on Buena Vista and other properties that were initiating these projects with help from the Pasture Project has led the department to where we are today, and what Mary C. is going to share with us next. So I just want to, with that, I want to say thanks for your attention. And I think we're going to roll right into Mary C. and I will hand it over to her. Mary C.
Well, I have to say I was very sad that we were not able to do this discussion on site last fall on a wildlife area down in, I think we were pondering going down to Iowa. Because if we were, Erin would get a nice round of applause right now. And much well deserved because of the hard work that she has done in really starting a program from the ground up. Okay, I was brought on board in the spring of 2018, and it was quite an opportunity. I've been working with grazing for a number of years through a nonprofit organization. Have a very large wheelhouse of producers in my back pocket, because when you travel 29 counties and occasionally the state, you get the opportunity to meet a lot of people. And so when I began my tenure at the DNR, essentially I walked into an environment that a lot of groundwork had been done, and there was essentially kind of 3 different pools of thought that were going on. But I was brought in when a project, which we can kind of think about a multi-leg stool. A hatch grant was applied for, and the DNR had begun the relationship to do some pilot projects as well as some research on some wildlife areas. And they partnered with the Pasture Project, UW-Madison, the Agroecology Master's Degree Program. And so there's 3 legs of the stool, and the 4th leg of that stool was a fantastic advocate for grazing, a gentleman by the name of Rod Ofty, that really went to bat in strategic places to keep the ball of managed grazing and managed grazing on public land moving forward. And, you know, a lot of groundwork was done. I walked into this program that had good field support, some pretty good leadership support, a grant that was really looking at not only how can we graze these wildlife areas, but also what are the sociological challenges with getting farmers to actually take the time, understand what DNR wants on grasslands, and get them into an actual grazing contract. So that sociological work, I think, was very critical in helping us to understand some of the barriers that were going to be faced if we took this to the whole state of Wisconsin. The Bureau of Wildlife Management, the bird and habitat section, saw an opportunity through the Pittman-Robertson program and actually pulled together a proposal on, okay, we're going to put the rubber on the road. We're going to, you know, have an effort in which we can expand our conservation grazing to improve our wildlife habitat. And one of the goals in that particular ask was to hire a specialist with a goal of adding an additional 2,000 acres to what was already a pool of there was some continuous rotational grazing or continuous grazing going on, and the rotational grazing had started. There was discussion with some farmers about doing actually management intensive rotational grazing. So there was interest from the field staff, the habitat managers, and their farm communities that, hey, we can do this. We can actually get more managed grazing on our public lands. And of course, along with that, there was many other things in that to-do list. Inventorying the timeline of PR, doing educational sessions, pulling together a group of internal folks to actually work on an overarching strategic plan. And then comes the grazing specialist. So coming from outside of the actual DNR culture, I have to laugh about this particular slide because you can read it in two ways. We now have someone who's worked in the agricultural sector coming into the conservation sector. And that could be conceived as kind of many different ways, but in all actuality, I found that the demand to have a specialist was overwhelming, and it was a great way to delve into not only identifying another 2,000 acres to get under grass, but to do the entire work list, which included inventorying all the sites that in our land management system showed up as having a pasturing contract, a grazing contract. And some of those turned out to be on fisheries sites. Some of those showed up to be in the area of the natural heritage conservation. Some of them showed up on park sites. And we actually ended up with a really nice pool of sites that were already under some type of minimal managed grazing, more like set stock, that we could work with the producers that were there, kind of raise the bar to get better management, really look at identifying how we want to do that. I was also charged with, educating some statewide, pulling together some statewide educational sessions because the demand for, hey, let's talk about grazing. Let's talk about livestock. Let's talk about how we do this to our benefit as well as the producer. Also identifying a team, not only within wildlife management, but across the fish, wildlife, and parks division to develop a statewide operations plan. And I'll go into that plan a little bit more as we progress through this discussion. And we also wanted to make sure that we connected across the entire family of the Wisconsin DNR because we never really knew where we were going to have these sites popping up. We also had organizational needs on the inside. The dashboard was created for tracking all the sites that were identified to have some type of a grazing plan on them. We also recognize that our land management system, which had really been kind of built to keep track of the farming agreements where there's actually corn, soybeans, alfalfa, really needed an update in order for us to capture the data that we needed to, I guess, track our infant statewide grazing program. So we know how many true acres are under management, what is outlined in the share agreements, and also what our soil types look like, because I'm really into kind of a soil junkie, to say, on the inside, but we really needed to collect better data. And as part of the farming guidance and policy update, we've added a whole new section that will allow us to collect better data for our grazing systems. Initially, we were talking about having that one overarching policy document, or do we need more than that? Can we cover all the places that have grazing on them, or the potential to do really good managed grazing for wildlife habitat needs? How are we going to address their needs? Can we do it in one document or not? We also have started to get producer summaries, which really helps with understanding additional needs that they have, coordinating new sites, and overarching. It's been a real struggle since the pandemic hit. Social isolation, I think everybody's dealing with it, but also It's nice to do conferences in person because there's so much more than just what we have in doing the internet and the social stuff that we can do here is somewhat limiting. And so when we get the opportunity to have another chat room, like on that Regain site, we should take advantage of it so that we can continue to share all the wonderful things that we're doing. I really want to take one moment to highlight this picture here. You will see Miss Erin Grossman right here with actually the gentleman in the blue shirt that is holding that wire so that she can cut or crimp is actually a secretary's director, which really I think goes to show how the hard work has gotten even the upper echelon of the Wisconsin DNR involved in the acceptance and recognizing grazing as a fantastic tool for us to move forward with to help us with our habitat needs. Okay, supporting documents in our strategy. Two teams were actually developed to kind of overarchingly address not only grazing. That team consists of wildlife management, natural heritage conservation, our Office of Applied Science. We also have a representative from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Grassworks is Wisconsin's educational arm to producers. There you have an upcoming conference here in next week on January 20th. And then we also have a representative from Pheasants Forever for some of the unique programming that pheasants are working on. It's nice to have that kind of a tie-in. That'll also help us as we educate our conventional user groups, our deer hunters, our pheasant hunters, our recreational users of our landscape, to recognize the benefits of grazing and why we are doing it on our wildlife and other publicly held lands. We also created the Ag Policy and Use Advisory Committee, and that's a broader brush stroke from fish, wildlife, parks, forestry, water resources. And we've also got representatives from the Wisconsin Farm Bureau and the Wisconsin Farmers Union. Here in Wisconsin, there's somewhat a little bit of an opposing point of view on conservation, on agriculture and agriculture practices. And the group really thought it was critical that we have both of those groups at the table while we talk about trying to use new and innovative tools for better water, for better habitat, for better opportunities, and keeping an eye on that soil loss. We've got so many environmental concerns that we need to work together in the conservation field, in the natural resources field, and in the farm community. We can do a lot if we all work together. Products that we are actually working on and in the development and approval process is because we had a huge influx of new staff, as well as coming off of the PR allocation. Our 2,000 acres goal ended up coming up with, I do believe it was close to 3,500 acres. And instead of having 12 initial projects that they thought were going to be implemented, we actually ended up with 21. And so we've got a lot of new people who are using grazing, and they need additional guidance because of the amount of workload that they carry to help them with their conservation grazing projects. And so the first product that was developed that received its initial approval yesterday was our Habitat Manager's Guide to Conservation Grazing. Currently in the works, we have the overall DNR grazing program strategy, and that we will be seeking additional guidance, not only from Fish Wild Parks leadership, but also our Secretary's office, to make sure that we are in line not only with wildlife, but with our governor's climate change policies and documents. And then we are also working on a grazing for conservation, a guide for non-game habitat, because there's a lot of little critters out there that need our grasslands, and they need a mosaic of them in order to be successful within their life cycles. And so here we felt it was necessary for us to have these 3 documents that will eventually guide us down, hopefully, a successful path to getting more grazing on the landscape. A lot of opportunities, a lot of pasture walks when we were able to. We've been able to foster positive relationships based on, not based on any compliance issues, which sometimes folks look at the DNR as being strictly compliance, but there's so many more good things that they do that they need to promote that as well. We're working across multiple, not only divisions, but within different state departments. We were part of actually weekly drought status updates to the health department here in Wisconsin because of the water issues with surface waters. And so we've really expanded our outreach. We've had tremendous successes. We've opened the door for communications with groups that normally were not necessarily interested in a significant presence from us. And so we've done a lot of really, really good work on the ground in a very short amount of time. And we are slowly achieving more buy-in across the entire DNR. This is kind of like the initial mosaic of what building a program that has already started. Wildlife needed to connect with parks with fisheries, back and forth, throw in the Office of Applied Science to try to address the needs of doing managed grazing in Wisconsin, on Wisconsin soils, with Wisconsin species. And we have some gaps. We have some great Western information. We've got some great Southern information, but we really need to build in more research in Wisconsin in order to service our wildlife areas and our public lands most efficiently. And then, of course, natural heritage. And then we have our external services, as well as the Office of Ag and Water and Environmental Management, that are all looking towards our grazing program as a way that they can help the greater agriculture community when it does come to things like compliance issues. Ox is slow and the earth is patient. Depending on the level of acceptance that you have within your agency, you have to take a deep breath and you have to understand, first off, we can't undo some of the things that we want to undo as quickly as we'd like to, especially when we're using biology to change biology. And what we may be able to do with fire in one season, it may take 5 or 10 years to do with grazing, especially when you're talking about invasive species as well as brush control. You're going to find audiences. You're going to have people who are readily going to accept grazing within your political structure. You're going to have some that are going to take the watch and wait, and you're going to have others that'll say it's just not going to work. But if you take the time, show them the successful examples, talk about how failures were learned from. This is a learning experience. And you're gonna carry your ball across the goal line. And I think with that, we're going to wrap up and see if there's any questions out there.
Thanks, Mary C. And thank you, Erin, for those great presentations. It's always really interesting to see how the program has evolved over time and all the very many details and logistics that go into making it a successful program. So if you have questions for Erin or Mary C, you can put them in the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand feature, which if you go to the bottom bar on your Zoom screen, there's a reactions little smiley face emoji. If you click on that, you'll see the raise your hand feature. And so between myself and Jane, we'll keep a lookout for those, and we'll call your name and you can unmute and ask. So in the meantime, we do have a question for Mary C, where can we find the Habitat Manager Guide?
That is right now, it is going to receive another, I'm keeping my fingers crossed, at the end of January. It will be going to Fish, Wildlife, Parks Leadership. And hopefully once that is approved at that level, then we will be able to share that with staff.
Great. So for right now, it sounds like hold tight. And maybe a good use of the Regain discussion group would be to announce that when it's ready.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. A question for Erin. Has each project you worked on been successful, and who pays for the infrastructure, maintains it, and how do you compensate for things like livestock loss?
So, in my opinion, they've been successful. We have definitely had periods of, where things did not go so smoothly. So, I mean, there's the year successes, and then there's the stumbling blocks. Overall, I feel they've been successful. Cattle loss, we have a contract and an agreement. So, the rancher incurs some risk when they put their animals out on the landscape, and that is theirs. Like if an animal is lost or stolen, last year I had a scenario where over the course of 2 days, the rancher I was working with lost 7 animals, and we don't know why. But that's their loss, essentially. I did my best to help out, and we problem solved. We talked a lot to try and figure out what happened. Ultimately, we didn't. So yeah, you just never know what's going to happen. You will have bad days, bad weeks, so forth. In terms of infrastructure, when we started, we had a lot of fencing supplies in-house already that we reused multiple times. So when we needed more, it was often PR dollars, Pittman Robertson dollars that we used. We also, because we charge rent for these pastures, we have an account within the department that's our farming account. So we use dollars. Basically, ranchers pay their fee that goes into this pool, and we were very successful at getting those dollars back. So it goes right from grazing to other grazing projects. And I think that answered everything. They're responsible for, everybody's different. On a lot of our projects, the rancher is responsible for fence upkeep when the cattle are in there. We usually assist a little bit on the off season just if stuff happens, but I think that hit everything.
Yeah, and to reiterate something you said in your presentation, communication.
Yeah, huge.
Huge, very key. Another question, this one's for Mary C. Have you seen a greater pushback from within the agency or from the greater public?
What I've experienced has been typically discomfort and lack of understanding. A class example is a site that happens to be a pheasant hunting hotspot, implemented grazing about 4 years ago. And the very first year, the hunter was coming out to scope out his spots and called the biologist and was very upset. And I promise the cattle will be gone before pheasant season. Don't worry about it. And, there was an angry conversation. Did a little bit of education. Cattle went away according to the contracted schedule. There was, a nice rest recovery period. Pheasant season came and went, and it was the best hunt this guy ever had.
Oh, look at that.
He was very excited. He took that back to his local Pheasants Forever chapter and said, I'm not going to tell you where this is, but, DNR's doing some new cool stuff and we may actually get better hunting grounds for it. It's kind of a roll of the dice. I think in terms of I think it's 50-50, 50-50. So we'll call it that and go to another question.
Okay. And also Kent Solberg asked that question, and our next presentation is going to talk a little bit more about that too. So that should be a nice carryover. Another question I think for either of you, is conservation grazing being used only on grasslands or also on oak savannas or in woods?
I'll address the woods, and that right now in Wisconsin is a pretty hard nut. There is several research projects working with silvopasture. And so I'm hoping that once we get our initial grazing documents done, we can do more education on the benefits to the oak savannas and in the woodlands. And Erin, if you want to address the different kinds of grasslands and where else we're grazing.
I will do my best. So I think, I don't know that there's any in oak savannas yet here in Wisconsin, per se. Most of what we are grazing are grasslands. There's a combination of cool season grasslands. That's what I predominantly work on. And then I believe some are grazing warm season grass fields within the state.
And I'll add into that reed canary grass in wetland areas. So it's a broad brush stroke. I think there's actually 8 different cover types that we're grazing on. And I was going to write those down and I didn't.
Another question for either of you. What has Wisconsin DNR learned about building more political support for grazing programs, given that administrations change and budgets fluctuate?
Actually, a number of years back, Wisconsin, through the National GLCI, Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative, was able to build a very strong grazing program on private lands. And at that time, the Wisconsin DNR was actually contributing to that as an effort to, help better conservation agriculture. There was a federal recognition of that. And then as noted, the political environment changed and all of that went away. Currently, right now, because of push, especially due to climate change issues, Wisconsin is really poised and struggling to get grazing back at a deeper level with a variety of different programs, as well as a potential specialist, again, through our Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. And if anybody watches the political news for Wisconsin, you will recognize that there is, for the since change in the administration, there's been pretty much a stalemate in any type of progression being made. And yes, it's very critical that as agencies who graze, the more we can partner with a variety of different funding sources, the more secure our programs will be as those political pendulums swing. Sometimes what in my mind feels like in a tornado. And so, yeah, diversification. And, once you get your projects up to a site that is really not only a working site, but you have that 5 years under your belt where everyone is comfortable, there's an opportunity like we have in Wisconsin to charge a small fee, have that go back into a pool of funds to continue the program.
So it sounds complicated.
Yeah, it's not, that's a whole nother, we'll do a whole nother segment.
I was about to say we should do another presentation about how to work within different like administrations and budgets and all that.
We're about grass and natural
Yeah.
resources. Politics, give us money and leave us alone.
Yeah, I hear that. Easy question for either of you. Have you used patch burn grazing methods? Probably more for Erin.
Yeah, so to my knowledge, not yet. There is a site on Buena Vista that the previous manager put in the queue to have burned. It was grazed last year, and I think cows are going to be back on this year after we burn it. But that is extremely, as we all know with fire, it's extremely weather dependent. So stay tuned, but as to date, no.
I will add to that. We do have a natural heritage conservation site that did their first year of implementation last growing season. And that is a site that we hopefully will attempt to do that, but on a much smaller scale than what they're able to do over at Buena Vista. Because just the size of the actual property, and that is down on the Hogback, down in Crawford County.
Great.
So it's in the works. We'll keep you posted.
Awesome. And then I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. There's several others in here, but is conservation grazing managed differently for a cool season versus warm season pasture?
Yes. Because it's goal dependent.
Yeah. Short answer, I like it.
Well, we're out of time.
Yeah, no, we're out of time. That's what I was going to squeeze it in there. So what's up next is we're going to take a 15-minute break, and I misspoke earlier. All of y'all are going to actually stay here. You can go get some coffee or whatever you need to do, and we'll come back at 2:15 for our next presentation, which is going to be Chris Trozen. He's going to talk about the importance of building relationships amongst public users and producers. And Jane is going to play some tunes for y'all to kind of relax to in the break, kind of like some waiting room music. And we'll see everybody back here at 2:15. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Erin. Thank you, Mary C, for your great presentations. We'll see everybody back in just a few minutes.